For over half a century, humans have endeavored to make business a force for good. But is the movement working? Or is it time to explore a new path forward? Welcome to Less Talk, More Action. We are your hosts, Joel Cesare and Owen Barrett, experts in clean energy, net zero real estate, decarbonization, and entrepreneurship. In each episode, we ask provocative questions and share stories from the front lines of sustainability with leaders in science, tech, and business taking real action to design a cleaner, better future. Thanks for joining the conversation. Now, let's get to work. Today is a special solo episode where you're going to get just me, Joel Cesare, the world's undisputed voice of building decarbonization and also known as, well, newly crowned king of AI-powered decarb. A nickname given to me by my usual co-host, Owen Barrett, who can't join us today, as has happened a few times here. He's running a business, trying to install solar all over the country, so sometimes he can't make it here to chat with us, but most of our audience thinks I'm the more interesting one anyway, so we're just going to dive right into a spicy topic here that I'm going to have a quick chat about. I'm going to call it the libertarian environmentalist. Now, one of the things that I've learned to enjoy about having a podcast is how, this is not all I do, and it's not all Owen does. We are on the front lines, working in the American economy with some of the biggest commercial real estate owners in the world, and trying to tackle real problems, installing solutions, AI-powered software that can hopefully lead to more scale decarbonization projects, and Owen, mostly solar on multifamily housing. So we are out and about learning, adapting, evolving, ideas changing with what we see happening in the world, in the economy, in our industry. And our podcast allows us to talk to many brilliant guests who are also informing these opinions. So something that's been really germinating for me for months, maybe years, is this idea that the environmental community so often wants to dive right to more regulation to solve the problems we think there are with the environment or the climate. And the more I've been doing this, which is now over 2 decades as a professional, the more I'm realizing actually at this point, 2026, I think we need less government. We need less regulation. The government and regulation are actually in the way. Now, it wasn't always this way. I mean, I recently was attacked on LinkedIn for some of this kind of narrative and saying what about the 70s and the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act? And thank God for the Endangered Species Act. And yeah, the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s and everything that kind of happened during that time, much needed. And we stand on the shoulders of those people. So no shade on that, but we have to be adaptable professionals who change our mind when we see new realities on the field. And again, I think this is where we're not realizing quickly enough. There's just this, and I'm not trying to be political, but let's just call it what it is. Mostly sustainability focused people tend to be left leaning. And there's this idea that the government needs to be the one to solve all these problems. And man, I just see a lot of examples in my career where the government is actually making the solutions we're trying to deploy harder to do and kind of exacerbating a lot of the challenges where it's about installing the technology that's been developed over the past 50 years so that we can all achieve the outcomes we want, but do it in a way that doesn't add more bureaucracy, add more red tape, add more delay and inaction that happens when you're trying to get things through the government, especially as you get into large state actors and the federal government. So let me just expand on this a little bit with some stories from my career. And I'll start with something, one of the first sustainability jobs I had. This was around 2013. I was in charge of a sustainability program for a $1 billion joint venture infrastructure project. I worked for the construction company that was the head of the joint venture. And my job was to deploy the sustainability program that was in the contract. And the clients were also a joint venture. It was BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, so the wider San Francisco-based light rail system, and what's called the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority. So this was the local transit authority that was going to be overseeing the 2 stations that we were building as a part of this BART system. So again, $1 billion, 2 new stations, tunnels, bridges, lots of rail. I mean, incredibly complex, all kinds of the joint venture I was a part of. So, I was working for a private company, the GC, but lots of government involved, all different layers. And, there was federal funding, and it was the state of California was deeply involved, and we're crossing county and city boundaries, and it just was, in a lot of ways, a very challenging project. So all that to be said, the story I'm going to tell is about how I looked at this large program that was in the contract that the Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority had identified, and it was largely following what's called the Envision program, which is like kind of lead certification for infrastructure projects. And it was somewhat interesting, but it was kind of mostly checking boxes and wasn't too interesting to me. And as is the case in a lot of my stops, try to think, okay, what's the box checking thing they want me to do, and then where's there something interesting, innovative, real impact I can lean into while I have the role I have. And in that case, it was lots of opportunities here. And it was something that we did with water. We're using water that was for dust suppression. Maybe I can tell a story about that later. But this was about the escalators. And so as part of building 2 new stations for BART, there was going to be a lot of escalators. And it was a pretty significant amount of energy usage that comes from escalators. And over the course of working with engineers on the project, we learned that you can slow escalators down. And if you're in Europe, you'll notice if you're ever approaching escalators in various environments, like they are stopped and then they sense you coming and then they turn on, or they're going really slow. And then when you get on them, they move at the pace we're accustomed to. And so I was like, well, we're installing new escalators here. Let's incorporate the software, the technology that allows them to either slow down when they're not being used or stop when they're not being used. And imagine these things are running 24/7 in these stations, how much energy that'll save over 10, 20, 50 years. And the company at the time, I think we were working with Schindler, who was going to be the selected vendor to install the escalators. They were a European company, and they were very used to this request and believed in the technology and didn't think much of it, but ran into California State OSHA department who said that's not allowed in California. And it was safety issues, cited how people that are approaching the escalator might not notice that it's not on. If it's not on, then that could lead to some other adverse outcomes. And there's a lot of reasons to where you poke holes in that and think, well, that's silly. That seems like an odd risk that we're going to be willing to waste all this energy for. But long story short, I spent months working with Cal OSHA and European colleagues, because the company I was at, Skanska, is a Swedish-based construction company. So I had lots of colleagues in Europe that are doing this stuff all the time. And just we spent a long time to just say, okay, like, let's work with Cal OSHA, let's deploy the technology, or let's prove how the technology is working elsewhere. And eventually we got it approved. But it was like one of these first examples of me like, wow, look at this. Like, this simple solution that's available elsewhere is just being held up. And the people I worked with at Cal OSHA were great. And immediately when we discussed this with them, they're like, oh yeah, that seems like a dumb regulation, but like, it's in the thing I'm supposed to enforce. So I can't just say yes to it. So we're gonna have to go through this whole special approval process. And again, eventually we did, but it took like 6, maybe 9 months to get to a point where like maybe the project I was working for was going to be able to put this in the design drawings and have it move forward as part of the progress. But I thought about this recently. I was in Europe last week and I got on an escalator, and this is what reminded me of this. And it was in the UK, and it was moving really slowly. And then when I got on, it sped up. I was the only one on the escalator. I was like, I wonder, out of all the things I've done in my career, I'm really proud. I've done some cool stuff. That one little move I made, or I pushed to get those escalators to change to this technology that makes them slower when they're not being used. I bet that's as impactful as anything I've ever done. And that was having to fight regulation to get it done. Okay, let me transition to a new story. I went and worked for the city of Santa Monica. I tell this story a lot. I got put in charge of the building project where we were going to build an extension to Santa Monica City Hall. And Santa Monica has a long, proud city tradition of being a leader in sustainable city planning. And we were thinking, how do we build the greenest building we can within the budget and constraints that we had at the time to build the building behind City Hall. And we ended up targeting what's called the Living Building Challenge. And the Living Building Challenge is kind of LEED on steroids if you're not accustomed to it. And you have to be completely net zero energy, fossil fuel free, and it has to be net zero water, which is really the more challenging part, especially in a Mediterranean climate like Southern California. So we dug deep into how we're going to get to net zero water in this building. And, maybe I can dive into all the thought process behind this in a future episode. But we ended up landing on composting toilets for a few different reasons. As it's a commercial office building, and one of the biggest chunks of potable water in a commercial office building is flushing toilets. And so if we can pretty much bring that water usage to zero with composting toilets, then we have a real shot at getting net zero water. And at the time, this building in Seattle called the Bullitt Center had already deployed these more advanced composting toilet like technology, or like a tech-enabled composting toilets. And the Bronx Zoo had years of experience with composting toilets, and the Chesapeake Bay Foundation building in Annapolis had years of experience with composting toilets, and then other examples around the world. And kind of similar to the project in the Bay Area with the escalators, like we did a lot of research to learn, okay, where is this actually happening, and why did it get approved there, and how much is the technology involved, and would the folks who were operating those systems recommend continuing to use them in other projects, and if so, how would they change the design to make them better? And all these answers led to, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. This can really work, especially for a city office building. There's all these other benefits about just being sort of resilient in the heart of the civic center of a municipality. But back to fighting regulation again, I was a city employee. We had to get those systems approved through my own building and safety department and our plumbing inspector, who was very opposed to us using the technology. So my colleague, I had to work with a lot to try to get him to sign off on the permit. And then there was the Los Angeles County Public Health had to give a special waiver to allow us to proceed. And this even went up to the California State Division of Drinking Water in various ways, and other actual state agencies like the California Coastal Commission. And so I really spent over 4 years of design development of that project, or maybe a little less, a good chunk of my time navigating the labyrinth of California water regulations to get this approved. And again, I won't bore you with all the stories. We ended up having to get the code changed, and we worked with the state of California on a number of different ways that can make future projects be more or have innovative water technologies more accessible, because California should be thinking this way. Everyone gets that there, but again, as I described, that you have to cross all these barriers: city, county, state. I mean, even there was ideas like, does the Safe Drinking Water Act at the federal level have to be involved in what we were trying to do? And again, it wasn't a technology problem. It wasn't a financial problem. It was regulatory. And those are two stories of mine in my career where some of the most proudest and biggest impact outcome strategies that I was maybe responsible for, or partly responsible for, they were enabled. What had to be done was overcoming regulation to get them done. It's kind of amazing how that's the dichotomy that we're describing this process in. And again, this idea was further advanced recently. Again, my trip to the UK, I met with a friend of mine. He's the head of sustainability at a large commercial real estate entity there based in London. And we used to work together when I was at Google, and he used to spend a lot of time over in Europe. And so we just were catching up about the industry and what he's seen in the UK and how things are different in Europe and what's the state of building decarbonization in his world. And it was really a fascinating conversation because, we can all think we know what's going on in other places, and you can read what's on the internet, but you don't really know unless you're talking to someone who's fighting these battles every day and having conversations with their bosses or their consultants they're working with or their peers. And this is what happened. So it's a really interesting kind of feedback I was able to get, but learned all about the UK's EPC system. And so it's kind of it's a little bit like in the US, what we call building performance standards, but there's kind of more teeth here in the UK, and it's called, what is it? EPC stands for, I think, Energy Performance Certificates. And so what's happening there is that's it's sort of a modeled base existing building energy performance metric where you get a score from A to F, where A would be you're the best performing, energy efficient and low carbon emission building, and F is a very low performing, what we might call a brown building here in the States. And then the idea is over time, they want to be able to enforce if an existing building doesn't hit a B, I think by 2027, or maybe it was a B by 2030, or maybe let's just say if it doesn't hit a B by 2030, I think that's maybe where the regulation is. There was a 2027 milestone, but he already thinks that's going to be delayed, that you're not going to be able to lease your space. So you could have a tenant come and say, I want to be a tenant in this building. And you could have the owner of the building say, sure, yeah, we'd love to take your money and host you in our building. And the government's going to step in and say, nope, this building is an EPCC, and so no financial transaction can happen. And I'm just to an American, I was just this is crazy. That's really what's going to happen? You're going to prevent economic activity based on this carbon and energy efficiency rating system? And look, I used to work at a city government. Again, before I did the building at Santa Monica, I was in charge of policy. I was looking at doing a building performance standard policy in Santa Monica in 2017, where we were collaborating with the city of Los Angeles at the same time to do what was kind of similar to Local Law 97 in New York, and what you might see is Energized Denver and some of these other regulations that we're all paying attention to now in the States, which I have been a vocal critic of, because back to this UK example, this guy was like, nobody knows what's going to happen. These dates, 27, 2030, EPCB, EPCA, they're based off some white paper that was written by the federal UK agency that's going to be responsible for enforcing it. So it's like a suggestion kind of, or it's like this warning, this is coming, this is what we intend to do. So you got the entire commercial real estate industry of the United Kingdom kind of operating on pins and needles, like, well, we got to do something, because what if this does get enforced? But then it's probably not gonna. And at the same time, we're also working to lobby probably the various entities to say, look, you're going to derail the economy, which is already in a precarious position, especially commercial real estate in a lot of urban areas. Maybe I won't speak for the UK. London seemed like a pretty strong commercial office environment from an economic standpoint, but I think other cities in the UK might not be as strong. And it just led to the same idea I've been having about the US-based BPS systems. I think Local Law 97 also has some funky enforcement mechanisms that are happening. It was supposed to be enforced this year, but if it's low-income housing, or if you've demonstrated good faith of trying to do decarbonization, they're not actually going to fine you, or they, according to the law, like they probably could be fined as of 2025. And Denver's already rolled back some of their requirements, at least from the date at which it would be enforced, or the type of buildings that are going to be enforced upon. And so if you live in sustainability and commercial real estate, this is such a topic of conversation. And it's like, it's the carrot or the stick, whatever you want to call it, that if you care about like doing this work, energy efficiency, clean energy, net zero, you often point, if you're like trying to get your company or other companies to do more, everyone says, well, look, you're going to get fined. Like these regulations are coming. Like this is no longer a nice to have. This is compliance. And I'm always kind of rolling my eyes like, yeah, I guess you people are saying that. And I can see how we want to use that as a threat to try to push action. Look, this podcast calls Less Talk, More Action. So if there was regulatory compliance mechanisms that I believed were actually going to be enforceable and lead to better outcomes that would stimulate action, then maybe I would be more open to it. But all I've seen in my career is these regulations are confusing. They're very difficult to enforce. When the going gets tough and there's economic downturns and you have urban areas where they're dealing with crime, and they're dealing with empty buildings, and they're dealing with vacancies, and they're dealing with people that don't have jobs, and the restaurants that require people to be in those buildings are struggling. Do you know what those people don't want in those moments? More regulation that makes it more expensive to operate and lease those buildings. And so, like, I guess my summary of this all is like, let's stop pretending like this is going to be a tool in our belt. That like there's going to be existing building energy or carbon emission based enforcement mechanisms that are going to lead to action. I think at this point, again, I'll come full circle here to the whole theme of the show, which is we don't need that anymore. Like that was maybe an idea if you thought the climate change is the biggest crisis in humanity at this moment, that we have to have this regulation or else all these buildings around the world are going to continue to consume fossil fuels and contribute greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and the only way to stop it is through this regulation. Maybe that used to be a mindset that was that had some kind of credibility, but at this point I think it's actually just making it worse. It's making these owners of buildings indecisive. It's I've talked to a few very sophisticated commercial real estate owners here in the States with sustainability teams that take this work very seriously, who have said, yeah, our asset management, our investment teams, they don't even underwrite like this stuff's going to get enforced, because everyone just kind of laughs at it at this point, because this is what continues to happen. It's back to the point. When the going gets tough, it's not going to get enforced. And it just makes everyone's job a little harder. And it's like, we rail on reporting a lot here. Some of these voluntary reporting mechanisms take a lot of time and energy and resources from teams that could be deployed to more action-based activities. That's one of me and Owen's core theses here. And I would say, figuring out how I'm going to comply with BP building performance standards, or if in UK EPC ratings, it's like, well, instead of that, I could just be really focused on using the technology that's available and the really smart people that have learned a ton about how to decarbonize buildings over the last 30, 40 years to say, like, let's make this argument to our investment committee and our asset management team and our investors that this is the right thing to do because it's going to make our building more efficient to operate and therefore going to be more valuable. And if we have teams focus on those things instead of how do I comply Or how do I show my chief compliance officer how we're going to comply? Or how do I spend half the year figuring out how to organize my data to submit to this third-party rating system so that they, I guess, think I'm doing something about it? If we just eliminated all that noise and said, let's take a libertarian approach to building decarbonization and just let people do what they otherwise would do anyway to make the buildings more efficient, I think we just cross this threshold where we don't need the regulation anymore, and actually it's making everyone's job harder and leading to more inaction. So, man, I've been going on this for 20 minutes. I didn't think it would be this long. And I guess my one last point is I think some of the stories that happen with the Inflation Reduction Act under the Biden administration, fair or not, I think there's fact checking to happen. I've been trying to do my own, but the famous kind of infamous story of the $7.5 billion that was allocated to install EV charging around the country, and Pete Buttigieg was in charge of the Department of Transportation. And I think some of the numbers that the conservatives like to throw out to kind of mock that system are inaccurate. But let's be honest, even if you are a fan or a supporter of that program, it was a lot of very slow moving and not much action on $7.5 billion as there could have been. And again, there's lots of reasons maybe we can point to, especially as the administration changed, the whole program got derailed. But it's just this example of you give $7.5 billion to the federal government, like they just can't deploy it. There's just too much bureaucracy. But then at the same time, again, if you're a fan of Tesla or not, let's give them credit. There's superchargers all over this country with or without regulation. Now, I guess you're going to say, well, Tesla had a lot of subsidization from the government over time. And I guess that's true. But I think we can all admit that Tesla's a lot better at installing EV charging than the Department of Transportation after the Inflation Reduction Act. And then there's, Owen and I have talked about this too, a lot of what happened in the Inflation Reduction Act with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which was, I'm reading now, like $27 billion was allocated for building decarbonization. A lot of us in this field, I was working at Block Power at the time, and we were laser focused on this money coming down because it was going to help us do the work we wanted to do, which was installing heat pumps in low-income housing. And Owen was very interested in it because it was going to help install more solar. It was going to bring down the cost of capital to borrow because the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund said they were going to try to give out money at like 2-3%. But by the time that money found its way through these newly anointed green banks or other middlemen entities that had never been created before, because there's just, when you try to get money from the federal government all the way down to the communities, or like people like Block Power, or companies like Block Power or Owen Solar Company, I guess there needs to be all these middlemen in the process. So it took so long to get that money out, and by the time it did, the election was coming, so that was, they lost anyway. And just there was, even if you don't think it was nefarious, just like a lot of money going to entities that you're like, who even works there? Who even talks to them? How do we know what cut are they taking from the 2%? So by the time I get it, it's actually the same debt rate I could get from a private entity. So, man, again, I'm at 24 minutes, so I'm going to wrap it up here. But I would just say I'm going to continue to explore this idea of the libertarian environmentalists, and I'm happy to be proven wrong and pointed to various stories or data points that say actually there's a lot of cases that are happening right now where the government's being super effective at turning regulation or incentives into action. So great, please reach out, send me notes on LinkedIn, or you can email the show. But to me, my experience, my learned experience, what I've witnessed in my career, the stories I just told you are just a few of the biggest, or at least the strongest examples of this. I think for those of us out there trying to deploy solutions to make the environment better, the government and more regulation seems to be getting in the way more than it's helping at this point. And so with that, I'll wrap it up. And nobody to thank. I guess we'll thank Owen for not being here and let me go on my soapbox, but thank you to our audience for joining. You can find Owen and I on LinkedIn, usually actively antagonizing the more talk, more complaining sustainability crowd. You can find this podcast and more great content at letstalkmoreaction.com. We'll be back next week with one of our another amazing guests. But until then, please, if you like the podcast, subscribe, like, and share with your friends. And until next time, we encourage you to ask yourself, what are you doing to take action to make the world a better place?